Hello friends and happy holidays. Thanks for joining me today. This media demonstration video is going to feature watercolor paint to finish this festive drawing. This one is one of my favorites. It shows pie and hot cocoa on a table, and it's indoors where people are warm and cozy, and it's cold outside, and there's a snowman. We can see there's snow falling, and it's just a really fun drawing at this time of year. You can make this feature any holiday you want, or you can also just make it a wintertime picture. That's what I'm going to do today. So remember guys, if you want a magnet, just let me know. A lot of you watch these now, whether it's because you use the videos or because you learn how to draw with me virtually, or maybe you were learning to draw with me in person, or maybe you're just interested in general. But in any case, if you want one of these magnets, just let me know and I will send one to you in the mail, okay? Otherwise, we're just going to go ahead and get started. So guys, today for the watercolor paint, I just want to make sure we have the right supplies. So I have a cup of water. You can see it's a nice clean cup of water. And because there's a lot of little things in this drawing today, I decided to use a medium and a small paintbrush. It's really important to have the right size paintbrushes. If you try to do all of this with a large paintbrush, it would look okay, but you would lose some of these fine details like the fence and all these little things. Also guys, I got my paint ready. And it always surprises my students when I tell them, but this thing, it's the lid, right? But it's also a mixing tray. It's got these little dividers on it, so you can clean it if you need to. You can have different colors in different areas, and it's just a really good tool to use. Also, I'm already pre-prepared with 2 paper towels, and I'm going to do that. And of course, this blue mat. I tell my students all the time, you really cannot underestimate the value of a mat under your artwork. So please, make sure you have all those things before you get started. So I'm going to do most of this in time lapse, and this is a really, really fun project. But as usual, I want to talk a little bit about watercolor paint. So what I see my students do a lot is they have barely any water, then they go like this, and then they're trying to paint with very, very little paint on their brush. And that doesn't work. Watercolor paint requires water. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the water and I'm kind of loading up my orange, because I know I'm going to make my pumpkin pie orange later, but I want it to be a slightly different orange than the one straight out of the container here. So I'm going to lift some of this paint. You see how I'm lifting it? I'm going from the little cake pan here into the mixing tray. And yes, these are called cakes of paint. And this is a cake pan. Even though there's no dessert here, it's going to be used to color dessert though. But anyway, that's what it's called. I'm also going to take a little bit of brown now, and I'm going to stir a little brown into my orange because I want a pumpkin pie color. I don't want it to be too dark, but I definitely want it to be darker than it was out of the mixing tray. And by adding this brown a little at a time, and I can also go back and say, well, I need a little more orange. I think that's a pretty fair looking pumpkin pie color. And so when I start to paint my pumpkin pie, I will have sort of a color that I feel good about. And also, you can also change it up right on the paper. So for example, if you're painting along and it's getting a little bit too light or a little something, you can just adjust it as you go. I just wanted to show you what I mean by that. So I've got my oranges here. And it's pretty nice, but I definitely want a little more. But I'm also going to take a little of this brown now, and I'm just going to touch the edges here. And I'm not going to go everywhere with it, but I'm going to just touch the edges here. Because sometimes, you know, when you're making a pumpkin pie, there's light and shadow on it, just like everything else. But sometimes there's a part of it that's a little bit darker. And it's really nice to have that contrast. So my pie is not 100% done, but I'm liking it. I like how it looks. If I wanted to, I could add a little orange. See how I'm kind of touching up the top now with a little more directly from the cake pan, directly onto the pie. Anyway, that looks pretty good. The other thing I wanted to tell you real quick before I go into time lapse is if you want to, you don't have to do the paper towel at the very end. Sometimes it's fun for the texture. I don't know if you can see this, but this paper towel has a texture on it. I am going to lay it down flat and lift it off. And what it did is it left a little tiny bit of the imprint from the paper towel on the pie. And honestly, I think that looks kind of exactly like pumpkin pie. So it's something worth trying. It's a nice and fun technique. All right, guys, I'm going to go into time lapse and I'll come back and do a short conclusion. But for now, just enjoy watching and think about what you're going to do to your winter treats and cocoa drawing. Here we go. Guys, so I worked on this thing and I did lots of color blending and mixing, and I just want to point out to you a couple things before I go. Sometimes, you know, one color will mix into another color. That is called bleeding when it comes to watercolor paint. You might have your green, for example, bleed into your orange, or you might have something, you know, mix unintentionally, and sometimes that's a happy accident, and sometimes you think, well, it's not quite what I wanted. And other times you realize that it looks just fine. The overall picture still looks fine. So I want you to know it helps a lot if you don't paint things right next to each other while they're drying. So for example, I worked on my pie, and then I worked on my hearts, and then my snowman, and then my trees, and I was trying to just sort of, you know, spread out what I was doing so that it was not too much paint in any one spot, but I still had some colors mixed together. And honestly, guys, it's not a problem. It's a watercolor paint piece of artwork, and watercolor paint does that. You may have noticed that I used gray for the whipped cream to create a shadow. Same gray on the snowman and the snow and the marshmallows. You don't have to use a lot of those things, but I think a little bit makes it look really cool. And you just get gray by having a little bit of black and a lot of water instead of a lot of black and a little water. Also, what else? I think you probably saw me switching from one brush to another. The pink brush is the smaller of the two. It just really helps. And I had already signed it here, guys, in the bottom corner here. So if you haven't signed yours yet, let it dry first and then sign it. You don't want to tear the paper. You can also flip it over and sign it after it dries. Stuff like that. Little things like that make a difference. But let's talk for just a second about this paint. So as you can see, I used my mixing tray. I have lots of these paper towels left, and you can see that I've got some water in every single one of my little cups here. And so what's going to help is for the future, meaning like next time I pull this out, if I just go ahead and clean it now. So I always try to get my students to have good habits for their art supplies. Art supplies are valuable and they're so much fun to use, but if you don't take care of them, they don't last. And then it's just kind of sad because you don't have them to use when you want them. So it doesn't have to be spotless, but you can see that that did a lot, right? So that is better. There's still liquid inside my paint trays here, my little cake pans, I should say. But just let it stay open, let it dry. If you close it right now, it'll take a really long time to dry. If you let it sit open like this, it might take an hour or two, and then you can close it up when it's totally dry, okay? So that's my recommendation on that. Also make sure your brushes are rinsed out. You don't want them to sit in the water because eventually these wooden handles will swell and shrink and these things will fall right off, and we don't want that either. So guys, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. This is such a sweet, cute drawing. As always, you can finish this with whatever supplies you have at home. But I hope you'll try watercolor paint and certainly make a couple of these because they're wonderful gifts. People love to receive artwork from people they love. So that's it for today. I'll see you next time, guys.